Boker Tov, Ubrachim Habayim. Welcome everybody to this morning's Taste of Torah. And today we're going to be talking about the double portion, Bahar Behukotai. Yes, it is once again a double portion. It's always good to understand why this craziness happens. So I just want to remind you, and I have a little illustration to help out. Goes like this. Our calendar since biblical times has been based on the cycles of the moon. A lunar year ends up being a little shy of a solar year, the time it takes for the Earth to go around the sun. So if you simply use a pure lunar calendar, the holidays fall away from their proper seasons over time across the years. So the Jewish solution is to add leap months. Perfectly functional system. I think other Asian calendars do something similar. However, we also have our weekly Torah portion. So the weekly Torah portion is divided up for the year. But what happens when every once in a while, every 7 out of 19 years, you end up adding 4 more weeks, 4 more Shabbatot? You got to do something in order to accommodate those and cover them with the proper Torah portion. So as a result, we've created this system where in a normal year, there are a number of Torah portions and they're bundled together as double portions. But when we hit that special leap year where we have to add weeks in, we can break those double portions apart and they become their own freestanding portions, and it takes us through the entire year. This year, however, we'll push it all back together. We are in a normative year with just 12 months. And as a result, we have all these double portions. So, but they're there in reserve for when we need them. So Bahar Behukotar, double portion. What's going on here? There's a lot of things going on here, but I would like to talk about that most important of human things, land. Land. We like it. We're used to it. However, our relationship to the land has changed in modernity because up until a few hundred years ago, land equaled wealth, right? Land produced agriculture and agriculture produced wealth. And that was the primary way that human beings gained and maintained wealth. We understand this. We interpret it in terms of house ownership. House ownership is one of the easiest ways for a family to build assets, to add resources. And so we hope that we will be able to translate our home ownership into wealth that we not only have to secure ourselves, but we can pass on to our children. And I think like that also, I have set apart a little piece of land for my boys in the hopes that when we pass away, they will have something that will make a foundation for their wealth through their lifetimes. And in case you're curious, here it is. This is my little piece of land. And hopefully someday they'll be able to build a little house on it. So, a little silly, but you get the point. Okay, so let's go back to, in the Wayback Machine, to our Torah portion, to biblical society, and we return to a non-monetary society where land and agriculture are the source of wealth. So what happens to the people who don't own land? They really have no plausible access to the growth of wealth. And this may not be a problem in some societies, but it appeared to be a problem in Israelite society. And so the Bible has an answer, and I'm going to explain it to you. It's pretty revolutionary, but I want you to understand also that just because we read it in the Bible doesn't mean it necessarily got completely realized. And we know this, right? There have been revolutionary societies with revolutionary principles throughout human history. A few of them succeed, many of them fail, but others of them only partially implement their revolutionary ideals. America is, I think, a classic example, right? We start out in 1776 with all men are created equal. But by the time we get to the Constitution, in 1789, 1787, 1789, what do we end up with? We end up with the 3/5 clause, that slaves count as 3/5 of a person, which serves to strengthen the political influence of the southern states with slave-owning states, and really perpetuates the system of slavery. What happened to all men are created equal? Well, it took us at least 89 years to implement the next stage of that, and quite honestly, we still struggle with it. So we understand partial revolutions, and that's probably what's happening in our Torah portion this week. The biblical revolution is through the concepts mentioned in our Torah portion called Shemitah and Yovel. Shemitah means a sabbatical year or a 7th year of rest, and Yovel we translate as the jubilee. It is 7 times 7 years, so on the 50th year there is a more general implementation of rest and release. The jubilee implies the release, and I'll explain what that means here in just a moment. Okay, but before we go forward, let's talk about the idea of partial realization in the ancient world. The Bible is revolutionary on so many levels. It's revolutionary in terms of talking about the nature of deity, which we sort of all understand, but it's also a fairly revolutionary social document. It envisions a society serving God that is startlingly different from the societies around it. Now, in retrospect, it may look very retrograde and ancient to us, particularly when we see, the multiple systems that regarding women and the fact that they do maintain a form of slavery in the form of debt slavery and things like this. It doesn't feel particularly progressive, but I assure you in the ancient world it was. But we have to remember that there is a distinction between biblical religion and biblical society and Israelite religion and Israelite society. In other words, there is a vision in the Bible about how we should relate to divinity and how we should relate to each other. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that system was in place. There were the Israelites living their lives according to probably pretty much resembling the way everyone else did back then before Greece and Rome. All right, so the biblical ideals may not correspond to the Israelite reality, and that's what we're talking about. So let's talk about Shemitah and Yovel. Shemitah and Yovel is this idea that certain things happen every 7 years and every 50 years, right? And the mechanism is this. First of all debts are put into remission every 7 years. All right. The second is that all debt slaves are released every 7 years. And the third part of it is the idea that all ancestral property is returned every 50 years. Now, there's another aspect of this, which is the land resting 1 year in 7. And anyone who's familiar with crop rotation can understand why that was implemented. But that's not what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on the social level of this, not the ecological level. So, all right. So here we have it. If you fall into debt slavery, you fall into debt in a non-moneyed society. How do you pay off your debt? You work. So you become a debt slave or a debt servant or an indentured servant is the English word for it. And you work for the guy you owe. But the time you can be held is limited because Shemitah says on the 7th year you have to release them. Not only do you have to release them, but you have to provide them with the fundamentals for them to make their own living. All right? Farm implements, things like that. All right. Likewise, if you find yourself, wait, no, I moved beyond myself. Okay. However, there are other levels of slavery in ancient Israel, just as there were in the surrounding cultures, like war slaves, people who were ethnically not Israelites, who were captured and theoretically could be held in perpetuity. However, the Yovel comes along every 50 years. And on the Yovel, or the Jubilee, everybody's released. That's why in American biblical tradition and in the history of American slavery, uh, Black people always talked about the Jubilee year, right? The year when they would finally be released. The Jubilee was never implemented in American society. Black people were chattel slaves. They could never be freed. We had to fight a war in order for that to happen. But according to the Bible, every 50 years, everyone goes free. And we know the phrase, proclaim liberty throughout the land and to the inhabitants thereof. We put it on a bell. So anyway, that's the ideal. And that's the goal. Now, let me tell you about the revolutionary part, and then let me reflect just for a moment on what actually was the reality. The revolutionary part is this. You could get your debts, get remission of your debts. You could be released from slavery, manumission. You could get your land restored to you, but it was entirely the prerogative of the king in ancient societies surrounding Israel. And what usually happened was this, was that a new king would arise, and in order to curry favor and to establish his bona fides as a just king, he would cancel debts. He would release slaves. He would return land to a family that had been seized from them. Now, you can easily imagine that, one, this is very fickle, and two, uh, this is often used to cultivate the upper echelons of society. Think of the War of Roses, right? The Duke of Gloucester lost all of his extensive lands because he didn't support Richard III during the War of the Roses. He had to flee to France, but he came back in support of Henry Tudor. And when Henry Tudor became Henry VII, Henry Tudor restored all of his lands. He got his land back. Thank you, King. Right? And so now he's beholden to the king. Now, Henry Tudor, no doubt, also did something similar for some very poor people in order to demonstrate that he was just a great guy, right? But we understand that this is primarily an exercise in power. Here's the revolution. The revolution is that in Israelite society, or at least as the Bible envisions it, God is the king. And therefore, God has the power to do all those things that are ascribed to a human king in other societies. And God doesn't do it on a unpredictable pattern. He does it on a regular cycle. Therefore, it must happen every 7 years. Therefore, it must happen every 50 years. And so it is a revolution in regularity. And it's also a revolution in the concept that poverty should never be systemic and perpetual, because the land was originally divided up between the tribes, the clans, and the families, according to the story in Numbers and Deuteronomy. And everyone had an ancestral holding. And if, for whatever unfortunate reason, they lost that land over the course of 7 years, they had to take out money, they had to go into debt, there was famine, there was drought, whatever, and they ended up landless and therefore without prospects. The system would rectify that once every 7 years. Land would be restored. All right. The person who purchased it would get the use of that land for 6 years. So it wasn't like no one would ever take the land because they couldn't own it permanently, but no one owned it permanently except the family for which it was originally intended. So that's pretty remarkable. Now it doesn't seem so remarkable to us from our worldview, from a capitalist worldview, but the idea that there was actually an attempt to systemically address poverty and those at the margin of society is entirely revolutionary for its time. So that brings us now to the question of, did it ever really happen? There's a difference between the biblical ideal and what was really going on in Israelite society. We can't say for certain. This we know, that the prophet Jeremiah in the 6th century railed against the authorities in Jerusalem because they refused to properly implement the Yovel, as it had been done before, he reminds us. So that would tell us that at least sometime in the 6th century, this revolutionary system of combating systemically poverty and disenfranchisement was implemented. I don't know if it was done once. I don't know if it was done 10 times, but there was an attempt to make this revolution real. Clearly, it wasn't complete, and unfortunately, before the next jubilee arrived, the Babylonians did and destroyed Judean society. So we don't know what would have happened after Jeremiah's time. But that was the ideal. It was maybe partially realized. And that leaves us where? Well, we don't deal with land the way our ancestors did. Our relationship is different. Most of us don't own land in that sense. But the principle remains the same. The issue of poverty is addressed on a twofold level in the Hebrew Bible. Alleviating poverty in the form of charity and tzedakah and helping people out over the short term. But there's also an idea that by law, there should be a mechanism for people to be able to escape constant, inevitable poverty. We try and do that in our society. We have some mechanisms for that from, bankruptcy and other systems, but they're incomplete. So maybe we too need to think on a twofold level. How can we in the short term help out the poor? But what can we do to modify our society in such a way that poverty is not a perpetual condition? That's the biblical ideal. How we do it is up to us. I hope this was interesting for you, and I look forward to talking with you next week.